So we're going to do a quick change now. So as we said, security is a key pillar of transatlanticism, but we also know economic strength is another important pillar. So how many of you know the acronym IRA? Or raise your hand. The Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act. Economic competitiveness is becoming such a big challenge. We're going to talk about that in a little bit and all the amazing policies that transatlantically we have to engage with. We also, another key pillar of transatlanticism is diplomatic boldness and nimbleness. And I want to begin this important conversation and welcome my colleague, Alexandra Scheffer, Senior Vice President here at GMF. We have been focusing on how swing states and middle powers, how they're using this moment of fluidity in the international system, how they are seeking their own interest, and how the transatlantic relationship looks at it. So, Alexandra, please come on up and please welcome her. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Scheffer. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour à tout le monde. The German Marshall Fund just recently published a major cross-regional policy report called Alliances in a Shifting Global Order. You have the first page right here. And this study was based actually on a policy work that GMF has been leading more than 10 years ago when we published a first report on the so-called global swing states. This year, we've been looking at 6 global swing states. Turkey, and we'll be having a panel on Turkey right afterwards, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and Indonesia. Why? Because these global swing states are increasingly playing an important geopolitical, geoeconomics role, both in their respective regions, but also in global affairs, but also increasingly in crisis diplomacy or crisis management. And so the big questions for Americans and Europeans, and that's the few policy recommendations we made in this report, is how do we redefine, how do we rethink, how do we be more creative in the way we engage and cooperate with these global swing states. Some call it neutrality, others call it non-alignment. I rather prefer the term of strategic multi-alignment because that really translates the fluidity, the transactionalism within which all alliances now are evolving. And so we are in this phase of calibration or recalibration and adaptation against the backdrop of both the war in Ukraine, but also the heightened US-China strategic competition. 3 of these global swing states were actually invited in the latest G7 summit in Hiroshima, Indonesia, India, and Brazil. Extremely interesting to see how this G7 summit actually translates, reflects the geopolitical transition that has been accelerated by Russia's war in Ukraine in many different ways. Russia's war in Ukraine, and this is really a finding that we have been gathering across this major study, has accelerated the collapse of 3 Western geopolitical illusions. And what we are today struggling with is how do we fill the gaps and how do we navigate through that new geopolitical transition. The first Western illusion was to think that Russia's war in Ukraine would put Russia in the category of pariah rogue states and isolate it on the international scene. It has very quickly become clear that Russia still benefits from the support of many, many countries around the world, certainly growing impatient for the war to end, but for now, keeping Russia's economy and therefore war effort resisting Western sanctions. Less than 40 countries have actually sanctioned Russia since the beginning of the war. This tells you a lot about the new geopolitics of alliances that has been deepening and accelerating since the beginning of the war. And the lessons learned probably is that we have underestimated the deepening ties between many of these countries and Russia, and by extension with China. The second Western geopolitical illusion that has collapsed with the war in Ukraine is the way we framed the war in Ukraine. The West against the rest, democracies against autocracies. Very quickly, this binary way of describing the power politics around the war in Ukraine has proven inaudible or even counterproductive, as we were realizing that we needed to outreach to the countries of the global south. And so one of the recommendations we made in that report was to say, let's simplify the message. And actually you can see the beginning bits of that at the latest G7 summit in Hiroshima, which is to say to these global south countries, well, look at what's happening in Ukraine. This is a disruptive, decisive moment for sovereignty, territorial integrity. And if we let Russia win, your own sovereignty and territorial integrity could also be put in danger. These are the conversations we should have in a much more simple way, not being obsessed with rallying other countries to our principles, but building and finding collective solutions, working on building a constructive role for these countries in finding a solution to the war in Ukraine. The second thing, it's not just the war in Ukraine, it's also that we need to boost cooperation on the global challenges that are affecting these countries. And there again, the G7 in Hiroshima was the first step towards that trajectory. Food security, agriculture, climate change, energy, supply chains, infrastructure. These are issues where G7 countries also need to strengthen and deepen their cooperation with these countries if they don't want these countries to totally be fully absorbed in Russia's or China's influence sphere. So I would sum it up by saying let's rely less on coercive diplomacy and invest more in confidence building measures. And this is where we might be more impactful, but that requires more, if I can say, creativity, more diplomatic creativity. The last and third Western illusion that has collapsed, and one that is really driving, I would say, the new patterns of cooperation in the international scene, is that, of course, we like being among like-minded people, like-minded countries. Like-mindedness is a very comfortable place to be. But the G7 today is not enough. The transatlantic relationship is not enough to tackle the war in Ukraine or to tackle today's and tomorrow global challenges. And so we need, again, to be much more creative, much more flexible and diversified in the way we work with other powers, because these other powers will have an increasing influence and saying in how wars end and in how all of these global challenges, climate change being number one, will be handled. This also coincides with a broader crisis of multilateralism, the erosion of the post-World War II international organization, the UN Security Council, totally paralyzed because of power politics, WTO is not working. And so this is also fueling ad hocism in the way we cooperate. Minilateralism, regional forums that are becoming much more assertive in terms of tackling regional and increasingly global issues. There's also, and that's something that we've been looking at in Turkey's, India's, Brazil's role, the rise of regional mediators, conflict mediators with a global reach. You see China proposing a peace plan, Brazil calling for a peace club, including many of these emerging countries. South Africa leading an African delegation to try and also find an end to the Ukraine war. These are very concrete indicators of this new geopolitics of influence and new geopolitics of alliance. And so to conclude, what should we do about this? Why is this important? For many reasons. We need, again, to reassess the way we have been cooperating within the transatlantic arena, but also with these other powers. We need to assess whether our old patterns of cooperation work, or whether we should reinvent or recalibrate them. And that's where, again, we need much more creativity. And I think we have been lacking creativity these last couple of decades. The other opportunity I see is that we need to reset the transatlantic conversation on and with China. I think it's very interesting to see a US rapprochement with Europe's de-risking approach instead of decoupling. There is a sense that there needs to be a transatlantic conversation on and with China. And I see today an opportunity to strengthen that conversation. And GMF, with its trilateral dialogues, US, Europe, India, China, Taiwan, Japan, is very well positioned to lead that. We also need to rethink our trade, strategic, diplomatic relationships with these global swing states. If we don't, and it's already the case, they will continue to deepen their relationship with China, with Russia, and then we shouldn't be surprised that it's difficult to break these alliances because we will not be able to do so. So again, GMF's Geostrategy Hub that I'm very lucky to lead today, through its network of fellows in the world, our offices network on both sides of the Atlantic really have this capacity to today provide decision makers, policy makers, business leaders, this cross-regional analysis of these swing state strategies to guide business, strategic thinkers, policy planners into this new journey for geopolitics, because there's going to be a lot of need of calibration, recalibration of our actions and of our long-term strategies. And you are all part of that conversation. And I would say let's broaden this dialogue beyond the Euro-Atlantic arena. And that's the aim of this policy report that I hope you will all have the opportunity to read. And with that, we will now dive deeper into the Turkish case with my colleague, Ian Lesser. Please, Ian, the floor is yours, and we have a wonderful panel to discuss. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.